Episode 3. Did the modern university come from the Islamic world? An AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Miles, and today we're doing something a little different. Instead of just learning what happened, we're asking a bigger question. Where did something come from? Like, college. Where did the idea of a university even come from?
And as simple as that question sounds, Miles, historians don't actually agree on the answer.
Which is kind of wild because I feel like college is one of the most normal things in the world.
Exactly. It feels familiar, almost timeless. But the university as an institution had to be created at some point. And the debate is about who gets credit for that creation.
Okay, so what's the debate?
The question is this: does the modern university have its roots in the Islamic world, or is it a uniquely European invention of the Middle Ages?
So we're basically asking who invented college?
In a way, yes. But more importantly, we're asking what counts as a university in the first place.
So, definitions are going to matter.
They're going to matter a lot.
Before we jump into the debate, can we talk about why this even matters? Like, why should I care where universities came from?
Fair question. Universities are one of the most important institutions in modern society. They train professionals, produce knowledge, and shape how societies think.
And they also create a shared intellectual culture. The way we organize knowledge, disciplines, degrees, expertise, that all comes from the university system.
So if we're trying to understand the modern world, this is kind of a big deal.
Exactly. And there's another layer. The university model that developed in Europe spread across the world. So understanding its origins helps us understand global intellectual history.
Okay, so this isn't just random trivia. This is like where modern education comes from.
Right. And that's why historians care about this debate.
All right, so let's start with the Islamic world. What's going on there before Europe has universities?
To understand the argument, we need to go back to what historians call the Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 12th centuries.
Golden Age meaning lots of learning?
Exactly. This is a period where the Islamic world becomes a major center of intellectual activity. Scholars are translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, preserving and expanding on earlier knowledge.
And this is happening at a time when much of Western Europe is still recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire.
So while Europe is kind of fragmented, the Islamic world is like a hub of learning?
That's a good way to think about it. Cities like Baghdad, located in the Middle East, in what is today Iraq, and Córdoba, located in the Iberian Peninsula, in what is today Spain, become major centers of scholarship, with massive libraries and networks of scholars.
Wait, Spain was part of the Islamic world?
Yes. Large parts of the Iberian Peninsula, which includes modern-day Spain and Portugal, were under Muslim rule for centuries. So when we talk about the Islamic world in this period, we're not just talking about the Middle East. We're also talking about parts of Europe, including southern Spain.
That's an important point, Miles, because it means there was direct geographic overlap and contact between Islamic and Christian regions, especially in Spain.
So ideas didn't have to travel super far. They were already kind of next door.
Exactly. And places like Córdoba became key bridges for knowledge moving between cultures. Historians often refer to Muslim-ruled Spain as Al-Andalus. It was one of the most vibrant intellectual regions in Europe at the time, with scholars working in Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew.
So this is like a cultural mixing zone.
That's a great way to put it. In cities like Toledo, scholars translated works from Arabic into Latin, which helped move knowledge into the rest of Europe.
And this becomes especially important as Christian kingdoms in northern Spain gradually expand south in a process known as the Reconquista. As they take control of cities, they also gain access to libraries and scholars.
So conquest is also spreading knowledge?
In a way, yes, it creates new pathways for ideas to circulate.
Which is why the Iberian Peninsula is such a critical piece of this story. It's not just a place on the map, it's a major channel for intellectual exchange between the Islamic world and Christian Europe.
I remember hearing something about libraries being huge there.
Yes. Some accounts describe libraries in the Islamic world with hundreds of thousands of books, while many European monasteries had only a handful.
That's not even close.
It highlights the difference in access to knowledge at the time.
Okay, but what about schools? Like, where were people actually learning this stuff?
That brings us to institutions called madrasas. These were centers of higher learning that developed across the Islamic world.
Madrasas, so like schools?
Yes, but more advanced than basic schooling. They offered instruction in subjects like law, theology, philosophy, medicine, and mathematics.
And importantly, many of these institutions were supported by the state or wealthy patrons. They provided funding, buildings, and sometimes even stipends for students.
Wait, they paid students?
In some cases, yes, students could receive housing, food, and financial support.
That sounds kind of like college.
That's exactly the point made by historians who argue that universities have roots in the Islamic world.
Because it looks like a system of higher education.
Right. You have organized instruction, recognized scholars, a broad curriculum, and even something like academic communities.
Were students traveling to study there?
Yes. There was a strong tradition of the traveling scholar, where students would journey across regions to study with famous teachers.
Okay, that definitely sounds like early college vibes. So then what's going on in Europe at this time?
In early medieval Europe, most education is centered in monasteries and cathedral schools. These are primarily focused on training clergy.
So not really like open universities?
Not yet. Access is limited and the curriculum is narrower, focusing heavily on theology.
But over time, especially by the 11th and 12th centuries, Europe begins to experience a revival of learning.
Is that connected to the Islamic world?
In part, yes. Translations of Arabic texts, many of which preserved Greek knowledge, begin to circulate in Europe.
So Europe is getting knowledge from the Islamic world.
That's widely accepted. The question is whether Europe also borrowed the institutional structure of universities.
So when do universities actually show up in Europe?
In the 12th and 13th centuries, we start to see the emergence of universities in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford.
And what makes them different from earlier schools?
This is where definition becomes critical. European universities are not just places of learning, they are corporations.
Corporations like businesses?
Not in the modern sense. A corporation in medieval terms is a legal body, a recognized community with rights and privileges.
Specifically, universities are communities of teachers and students, known as a universitas.
So it's like an official organization.
Exactly. They have legal recognition, the ability to grant degrees, and a defined structure.
Degrees like bachelor's and master's?
Yes, those begin to emerge in this system.
And universities are divided into faculties: arts, law, medicine, and theology.
Okay, so now this is starting to sound like modern college. So now we've got both sides set up. What's the argument that universities came from the Islamic world?
The historian Mehdi Nakostin argues that the roots of the university system lie in the Islamic Golden Age.
Because of the madrasas?
Yes. He points to their organization, curriculum, and support systems. He argues that these institutions functioned as early universities and influenced Europe.
He also emphasizes the transmission of knowledge. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded classical learning, which later entered Europe.
So the idea is that Europe didn't invent universities from scratch. It built on what already existed.
Exactly.
So what's the argument against that?
Walter Rüegg takes the opposite position. He argues that the university is a uniquely European institution.
Even with all that influence from the Islamic world?
Yes, because he defines a university very specifically as a corporate body with legal rights, degrees, and institutional autonomy.
And madrasas don't have that?
Not in the same way. They are centers of learning, but they don't function as self-governing corporations with standardized degrees.
Rüegg's argument is that while Europe may have borrowed knowledge, the institutional form of the university is distinctly European.
So this is where the definitions really matter. Okay, I think I'm starting to see the issue. If you define a university broadly, the Islamic world has them first. If you define it narrowly, Europe does.
Exactly. That's the core of the debate.
Historians are not necessarily disagreeing about the evidence. They are interpreting it differently.
So it's not like one side is right and the other is wrong.
It's more about perspective and emphasis.
That's kind of frustrating, but also kind of interesting.
That's historiography.
So is there a middle ground here?
Many historians today would say yes. The Islamic world played a crucial role in preserving and developing knowledge and in creating institutions of higher learning.
And Europe took that intellectual foundation and developed a new kind of institution, the university as a corporate body.
So it's less about who invented it and more about how different cultures contributed to it.
That's a strong way to think about it.
So maybe the better question isn't who invented universities, but how did universities develop over time?
Exactly.
All right, so here's what I'm taking away. The Islamic world had advanced systems of learning before Europe's universities existed. Europe then created a specific institutional model that we still use today. And historians argue about how those two things connect.
Well said, Miles.
And that's the key skill in history, learning to evaluate different interpretations.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get why we're doing historiography episodes. That's it for today. In episode 4, we're shifting gears into the Renaissance and looking at how political and economic changes in Italy helped spark new ideas about art, education, and human potential.
A major turning point in European history.
And one that builds directly on the intellectual developments we talked about today.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Outro music.